Grace Elizabeth Parker stood at the cracked mirror in her tiny boarding house room, adjusting the worn lace collar of her only decent dress. At 25, her hands bore the calluses of factory work, but her green eyes still held traces of the dreams she'd harbored before becoming a widow at 21. 6-year-old Hope sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, carefully braiding wildflowers into a makeshift bouquet. "Mama, do you think Mr. Fitzgerald will like me?" the child asked, her voice carrying both excitement and uncertainty. Grace forced a smile, though her stomach churned with the weight of their desperate circumstances 3 months behind on rent. Their last coins spent on train tickets to Millbrook Valley. The morning sun cast long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape. As their train pulled into Millbrook Station, Grace clutched Hope's small hand while scanning the platform for a man matching Edward Fitzgerald's description: tall, graying temples, kind eyes, as he'd written in his careful script. Their correspondence over 6 months had revealed a gentleman farmer seeking companionship after years of caring for his ailing mother. Someone who wouldn't judge a woman with a child born of love rather than scandal. The station master's weathered face showed surprise when Grace approached with her travel-worn carpetbag. "You're the bride Edward's been expecting," he said, not quite a question. "He's waiting at the church, ma'am. Been there since dawn." Single church stood like a beacon of hope at the town's heart, its white steeple piercing the morning sky. Grace's steps grew heavier as they approached, Hope skipping beside her with the resilient joy only children possess. Through the open doors, she glimpsed Edward's broad shoulders encased in his best Sunday suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed. Several townspeople had gathered, more curiosity than celebration, their faces reflecting the skepticism reserved for outsiders, especially women arriving under questionable circumstances. The Reverend, a kind-faced man with gentle eyes, welcomed them warmly, though Grace noticed how his gaze lingered on Hope with a mixture of compassion and concern. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Edward turned as they entered, his face lighting with genuine warmth that made Grace's heart flutter with unexpected hope. "Grace, my dear, and this must be little Hope," he said, extending his hand with the gentle courtesy his letters had promised. But, as he stepped forward, his face suddenly contorted with pain, his hand clutching his chest. "Edward!" Grace cried, reaching for him as he collapsed, his body hitting the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. In seconds, the church erupted in chaos, women screaming, men rushing forward, Hope's terrified, sobs piercing the air as the man who was to become their salvation died before their very eyes. The doctor's grim pronouncement of heart failure hung in the air like incense. Grace knelt beside Edward's still form, her wedding dress now stained with dust and tears, her dreams crumbling like autumn leaves. Hope clung to her mother's skirt, whimpering softly as strangers whispered around them, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of witnessing scandal. Catherine Fitzgerald, Edward's stern-faced sister, pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Remove that woman and her bastard child from my brother's sight," she hissed, her gray eyes blazing with grief and suspicion. "She's nothing but a gold digger who killed him with her very presence." Grace rose on unsteady legs, lifting Hope into her arms as the child sobbed against her shoulder. The weight of their situation crashed over her like a collapsing mineshaft. No husband, no home, no money, and now trapped in a town where she was already branded as cursed. "Please," she whispered to the Reverend, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of voices. "We have nowhere to go. Our return tickets." She couldn't finish, couldn't admit they'd sold their return passage to buy Hope new shoes for the wedding. The Reverend's wife, Martha, stepped forward with the quiet strength of a woman who'd weathered many storms. "You'll stay with us tonight, dear. Tomorrow, we'll sort things properly." In the parsonage's simple guest room, Grace sat on the narrow bed holding Hope as her daughter finally fell into exhausted sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear heated voices, Catherine Fitzgerald demanding they be sent away immediately. The Reverend's calm but firm refusal. "My brother's death is on her hands," Catherine's voice carried. "Mark my words, that woman brought nothing but trouble." Grace's tears fell silently onto Hope's golden hair as she faced the brutal reality. They were truly alone now, in a place where they would never be welcome. The moonlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock her. Dreams of security and belonging. Morning brought unexpected visitors. Jonathan Pierce, a distinguished lawyer from the county seat, accompanied by Catherine Fitzgerald, whose hostility had crystallized overnight into something harder and more dangerous. "Mrs. Parker," Jonathan said, removing his hat with professional courtesy, "I need to discuss your situation regarding my late client, Edward Fitzgerald." Grace felt her throat constrict, assuming they'd come to formalize her exile. Instead, Jonathan opened his leather portfolio with the careful precision of a man bearing momentous news. Before his death, Edward made certain legal arrangements. His will, witnessed and properly filed, names you as his primary beneficiary. The words hit Grace like lightning, impossible and terrifying in their implications. Catherine's face went white, then red, then white again. "That's impossible," she sputtered, her composure cracking like ice in spring. Edward would never. He barely knew this woman, but Jonathan's expression remained grave and certain as he produced the official documents. "Your brother was quite specific, Miss Fitzgerald. To quote, 'Should anything prevent our marriage, Grace Elizabeth Parker shall inherit all my worldly possessions, including the farm, livestock, and monetary holdings, as she has already proven herself worthy through her courage in seeking a new life.'" Grace's hands trembled as she processed the impossible words. Edward had not only planned to marry her but had prepared for the very catastrophe that had befallen them. The implications struck Grace like physical blows. Edward's farm encompassed 300 acres of prime valley land, cattle, horses, equipment worth more than she'd earned in 5 years of factory work. "There's more," Jonathan continued quietly. "A bank account containing $23,000. Your late husband was far more prosperous than he let on." Even to his sister, Hope tugged at Grace's skirt, sensing the adult's tension without understanding its source. Catherine's voice shook with fury. "I'll contest this will. No court will uphold a fortune going to a stranger over blood family." Grace felt the familiar weight of fighting for survival, but this time the stakes were beyond her wildest imagination. "The will is ironclad," Jonathan assured Grace, though his eyes reflected the battles ahead. "However, Miss Fitzgerald has the right to challenge it, and given the unusual circumstances, public opinion may complicate matters." Grace looked down at Hope, whose blue eyes gazed up with complete trust in her mother's ability to protect them. The enormity of what Edward had done, this final, incredible act of faith in a woman he'd known only through letters, filled her with both gratitude and terror. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do this?" Jonathan's smile was sad but warm. "His letter to me said you reminded him that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it." Standing before Edward's farmhouse that afternoon, Grace felt as if she'd stepped into someone else's life. The 2-story White House with its wraparound porch spoke of prosperity earned through honest work, vegetable gardens, apple orchards, barns housing sleek cattle and sturdy horses. Hope ran ahead, delighting in the chickens that scattered before her, while Grace moved in a daze through rooms filled with comfortable furniture and shelves lined with books. In the kitchen, fresh bread sat cooling, left by neighbors who'd expected Edward's return with his bride. The silence felt pregnant with possibility and threat, as if the very walls were holding their breath to see whether she would prove worthy of Edward's extraordinary gift. The first week brought a parade of visitors, each measuring Grace with different standards. Mrs. Henderson from the general store arrived with preserves and pointed questions about Grace's previous arrangements. Tom Bailey, Edward's closest neighbor, offered help with the cattle, while his wife Sarah hung back, clearly conflicted between Christian charity and social suspicion. Through it all, Hope adapted with the resilience of childhood, making friends with the farm cats and learning to collect eggs from bemused hens. Grace watched her daughter bloom in this environment that seemed designed for children's laughter, and felt the first stirrings of belonging, followed immediately by the fear that it could all be stripped away. Catherine's campaign began subtly, but grew bolder each day. She visited the general store, the church, the schoolhouse, planting seeds of doubt about Grace's character and motives. "Mark my words," Grace overheard her telling Mrs. Henderson, "that woman studied my poor brother's letters, learned exactly what he wanted to hear. She's a practiced seductress who probably killed her first husband too." The whispers followed Grace through town like shadows, growing heavier with each retelling. Hope, mercifully, remained oblivious, chattering about her new kittens and the prospect of starting school in the fall. Jonathan Pierce became Grace's lifeline, visiting weekly to navigate the legal complexities while offering quiet encouragement. "These things take time," he counseled, as they reviewed documents in Edward's study, now hers by law but feeling like borrowed space. Catherine has hired a lawyer from Denver, a man known for theatrical courtroom displays. They'll argue emotionally, distress, undue influence, anything to cast doubt on Edward's mental state. Grace's hands clenched in her lap. He was perfectly lucid in his letters, thoughtful, careful about every word. Jonathan nodded, making notes. That's what we'll prove. But Grace, you need to understand this. Fight could last months, even years. The town's division became increasingly apparent. Reverend and Mrs. Mitchell remained steadfast allies, their kitchen table becoming Grace's sanctuary for honest conversation. The young schoolteacher, Miss Ellen Davis, visited regularly, charmed by Hope's quick mind and eager to champion them both. But others, particularly the older families, who remembered Edward's mother's disapproval of outsiders, aligned themselves with Catherine. Sunday services became exercises in social navigation, friendly nods from some pews, cold shoulders from others. Grace felt like a woman balanced on a tightrope, each step requiring careful calculation. May brought the first real crisis. Grace woke to find her vegetable garden destroyed, young plants torn from the earth and scattered like broken dreams. The violence of it felt personal, intimate, a violation that left her shaking with more than anger. Hope cried over her destroyed wildflower patch, while Grace surveyed the damage with growing certainty. This was no accident of weather or wildlife. Neighbors who came to help spoke in hushed tones about vandals and troublemakers, but their eyes carried knowledge of who might harbor such malice. Tom Bailey helped her replant, his weathered hands gentle with the damaged seedlings. "Don't let them break you," he said quietly. "Edward saw something special in you. Trust that." That evening, as Grace tucked Hope into bed in the pretty room that had once belonged to Edward's nieces during summer visits, her daughter asked the question that pierced her heart. "Mama, are we going to have to leave again?" Grace smoothed the golden hair, so like her own, and felt something crystallize within her chest. "No, sweetheart. This is our home now. Whatever it takes, we're staying." The promise felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that wings would appear. But as she looked around the room at the handmade quilt, the bookshelf filled with fairy tales, the window seat perfect for rainy day reading, Grace understood that she was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the life Edward had envisioned for them. The life Hope deserved. That summer brought the first legal hearing. Held in the county courthouse with its imposing oak paneling and stern-faced judge, Catherine's lawyer, a theatrical man named Frederick Blackwood, painted Grace as a calculating opportunist who'd manipulated a lonely man's affections. "Your Honor," he declared with practiced outrage, "we have here a woman of questionable morals, a single mother with no verifiable history, who somehow convinced my client's brother to leave her everything after mere months of correspondence." Grace sat rigid beside Jonathan, Hope fidgeting in the gallery under Mrs. Mitchell's protective wing. The words felt like stones thrown at glass, each one threatening to shatter the fragile legitimacy she'd tried to build. Jonathan's response was measured but powerful, presenting Edward's letters as evidence of a thoughtful, deliberate man making careful choices. "Edward Fitzgerald was neither fool nor invalid," he told the court. "His correspondence reveals a gentleman of intelligence and discernment who recognized in Mrs. Parker the qualities he valued: courage, devotion to family, and moral strength." He read passages from Edward's letters that made Grace flush with remembered hope. Grace writes of her daughter with such tenderness, such fierce protection. Any woman who can raise a child with such joy despite hardship has proven her character beyond question. The judge listened impassively, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The hearing's aftermath brought fresh scrutiny. Newspaper reporters from Denver arrived, drawn by the unusual story of the mail-order widow and her mysterious inheritance. Their questions felt invasive, probing. "How well did you really know Edward Fitzgerald? What exactly did you promise him in your letters?" Grace learned to give short, careful answers while Hope hid behind her skirts, overwhelmed by the attention. That evening, she found graffiti on the barn door, "Murderer" painted in angry red letters. As she scrubbed it away with shaking hands, Grace realized the fight had escalated beyond legal proceedings into something darker and more personal. August brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who'd attended Edward in his final moments, requested a private meeting. "I need to tell you what I observed that morning," he said. sitting uncomfortably in Edward's now Grace's front parlor. "Your husband-to-be spoke of you before the ceremony. He was excited, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since his mother's death. There was no sign of coercion or mental instability. The doctor's testimony could prove crucial, but Grace sensed his reluctance to become involved publicly. "I'm not a young man," he admitted. "Catherine Fitzgerald has influence in this county, but conscience demands I speak the truth when the time comes." The general store incident shattered Grace's remaining illusions about community acceptance. When she arrived with hope for weekly supplies, Mrs. Henderson refused to serve them. "I can't have murderers in my establishment," the woman declared loudly enough for other customers to hear. "Find somewhere else to spend your blood money." Hope began crying as other patrons stared and whispered. Grace lifted her daughter and walked out with as much dignity as she could muster, but the humiliation burned like acid. That night, she found herself questioning everything. Perhaps Catherine was right. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps Edward would still be alive if she'd never answered his advertisement. Jonathan's visit the following week brought news that shifted everything. "I've been investigating Edward's correspondence with other potential brides," he announced, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "Grace, he wrote to 17 women over 3 years. He kept copies of every letter, including their responses." The revelation stunned Grace. She hadn't been Edward's only option, but his final choice. "Read this," Jonathan said, indicating one of Edward's drafts. He wrote to his lawyer, "Grace Parker is different from the others. She doesn't promise me perfection, but honesty. She speaks of her daughter not as burden but as blessing. This is the woman I want to build a life with." The threat arrived in the form of a legal document delivered by County Sheriff. Catherine had petitioned to have Grace declared an unfit guardian, seeking custody of Hope while the inheritance case proceeded. "Moral turpitude and questionable associations," the papers declared, citing Grace's unmarried pregnancy and current precarious situation as evidence of inability to provide proper care. Grace's hands shook as she read the detailed accusations that she was raising Hope in an environment of conflict and uncertainty, that the child had been exposed to adult matters beyond her comprehension. The possibility of losing Hope felt like watching her own death approach, inevitable and crushing. That night, Grace sat in Edward's study surrounded by his books, his careful records, his evidence of a life well lived, and faced the brutal mathematics of her situation. Fighting Catherine would require money for legal fees she barely had, time she couldn't afford, and emotional strength that felt increasingly depleted. But surrendering meant losing not only Edward's gift but Hope as well, returning to the poverty and insecurity that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, as Grace confronted the most important decision of her life, Hope's innocent question. The next morning crystallized Grace's resolve. "Mama, why was that scary man here yesterday? Are we in trouble again?" Looking into her daughter's trusting blue eyes, Grace felt something fierce and unbreakable crystallize in her chest. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. We're home, and we're staying home." She began that day to truly fight, not just defensively, but with the strategic determination of a woman who'd finally found something worth any sacrifice. If Catherine wanted a war, Grace would give her one, but it would be fought on terms that protected Hope above all else. Grace's counterattack began with the community itself. She started attending every church social, every town meeting, every gathering where she could demonstrate her character through actions rather than defending it with words. She volunteered to help Mrs. Bailey with her new baby, brought soup to families struck by illness, organized a school fundraiser with Miss Davis. Slowly, incrementally, she began to shift public perception from suspicion to grudging respect. Hope thrived in this environment, her natural charm winning over even skeptical hearts as she helped elderly Mrs. Thompson with her garden and shared her kitten's antics with lonely widowers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Edward's personal effects, stored in the attic since his mother's death. Grace discovered boxes of photographs, letters, and journals that painted a detailed picture of a thoughtful, generous man who'd spent years caring for his aging mother while yearning for companionship. Most importantly, she found his correspondence file, not just copies of letters to potential brides, but detailed notes about his hopes, fears, and decision-making process. Grace Parker read one entry dated just weeks before his death. Writes with sincerity about life's hardships and joys. She doesn't seek rescue but partnership. This is what I want, not a woman desperate enough to say anything, but one honest enough to reveal her flaws alongside her strengths. Jonathan's excitement was palpable when he arrived the following day. "Grace, you've found our smoking gun," he said, carefully examining Edward's private journals. These entries prove deliberate choice over months of consideration. Look here, he specifically writes about rejecting other candidates because they seemed too eager to please or unwilling to discuss difficult realities. But the truly explosive revelation came in Edward's final entry, written the night before their wedding. "If something should happen to me before Grace arrives, I want her to have everything. She has already given me something precious, the hope that love can still exist without conditions. She deserves the security I can provide, and hope deserves the childhood I can give them both." Catherine's fury upon learning about the journals was volcanic. She appeared at the farm with two men Grace didn't recognize, demanding access to family property that was being hidden from the courts. Grace stood firm in the doorway, Hope behind her, refusing entry until proper legal procedures were followed. "You have no right to anything in this house," Catherine snarled, her composure finally cracking completely. "You killed my brother with your greed, and now you're trying to steal his memory too." But her desperation showed that journals were damaging to her case. Proof that Edward's decision had been neither sudden nor influenced. The second legal hearing, armed with Edward's journals and Dr. Morrison's reluctant but honest testimony, shifted the case's momentum. Catherine's lawyer seemed less confident as Jonathan methodically presented evidence of Edward's careful consideration and genuine affection. The deceased left clear, documented proof of his intentions, the judge noted, reviewing the journal entries. "While the circumstances are certainly unusual, there's no evidence of coercion or mental incapacity." Grace felt the first real hope she'd experienced since Edward's death, but Catherine's lawyer wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we maintain that this woman's presence directly contributed to Edward Fitzgerald's fatal heart attack, emotional stress, anticipation of a questionable union." Dr. Morrison's testimony became the hearing's turning point. The elderly physician, clearly uncomfortable but determined, explained Edward's pre-existing heart condition and known to everyone, including Catherine. "He'd been experiencing episodes for months," the doctor revealed. "He consulted me privately, expressing concern about his health, but refusing to let it prevent him from pursuing happiness. The attack could have happened at any time during farm work, in his sleep, while reading. The timing was tragic coincidence, not causation." Catherine's face went white as this revelation undermined her entire case. Grace felt vindicated but also profoundly sad. Edward had faced his mortality alone, choosing to embrace love despite knowing the risks. The custody hearing for Hope represented Grace's darkest hour. Catherine's lawyer painted a picture of an unstable environment, a child caught between legal battles and community hostility. "This innocent girl," he declared with practiced sympathy, "deserves better than life as a pawn in an adult conflict she cannot understand." Grace watched in horror as seemingly reasonable arguments were constructed around partial truths. Hope had witnessed tension. Yes, their life contained uncertainty. When called to testify, Grace's voice shook as she spoke of her love for her daughter, her commitment to providing stability, her dreams of the peaceful life Edward had envisioned for them both. But the judge's questions were sharp, probing, clearly considering whether separating Hope from this situation might indeed be in the child's best interest. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom, but in the town square on a crisp October morning. Catherine, apparently pushed beyond all restraint by the mounting evidence against her case, made a public scene that would define both women forever. "She murdered my brother as surely as if she'd held a gun to his heart," Catherine screamed at anyone who would listen. "Look at her, a woman with no morals, no family, no past worth claiming. Edward was a fool, and she took advantage of his loneliness." Grace stood quietly through the tirade, Hope's small hand clasped in hers, as townspeople gathered to witness the spectacle. When Catherine finished, Grace's response was soft but clear. "Your brother was a good man who chose kindness over suspicion, hope over fear. I'm sorry your grief has made you forget who he really was." Catherine's public breakdown had unintended consequences. Instead of rallying support, it revealed the extent of her desperation and vindictiveness. Mrs. Henderson, who'd refused Grace service, quietly approached afterward to apologize. "I've been letting grief and gossip cloud my Christian judgment," she admitted. "Edward was always a good judge of character. If he chose you, that should have been enough for all of us. Others followed tentative overtures, small acts of inclusion, the slow rebuilding of community acceptance. Tom Bailey spoke up at the next town meeting. I've watched Grace Parker work that farm like she was born to it, raise that little girl with more love than some folks show their own blood. Maybe it's time we focused on what we can see instead of what we can imagine. The final legal hearing took place on a gray November day that seemed to mirror the solemnity of the proceedings. Judge Harrison, having reviewed all evidence and testimony, spoke with the measured authority of someone who understood the far-reaching implications of his decision. This case has presented unusual circumstances requiring careful consideration of both legal precedent and human compassion. He began. Grace held her breath as he reviewed the evidence. Edward's journals, his documented decision-making process, Dr. Morrison's medical testimony, and the clear language of a legally binding will. The deceased was demonstrably of sound mind and clear intention. His bequest to Mrs. Parker, while unconventional, was made freely and with full understanding of its implications. Furthermore, the judge continued, regarding the custody petition, this court finds no evidence of unfitness or endangerment. Hope Parker is clearly thriving under her mother's care, and the temporary disruptions caused by these proceedings do not constitute grounds for removal from a loving, stable home. Catherine's face crumpled as the judge's words sealed her defeat. But Grace felt no triumph, only exhaustion and profound sadness that Edward's gift had required such a battle to claim. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder as the judge delivered his final statement. Mrs. Grace Parker is hereby recognized as the lawful inheritor of Edward Fitzgerald's estate, with all rights and privileges thereto. This court's decision is final. Outside the courthouse, Catherine made one final attempt to wound Grace where it would hurt most. You think you've won, she said, her voice hollow with defeat and bitter rage, but you'll never truly belong here. You'll always be the outsider who got lucky, the woman who inherited what she never earned. Grace stopped walking, Hope's hand still secure in hers, and turned to face Edward's sister with the quiet dignity that months of struggle had refined into strength. You're right that I didn't earn Edward's gift through blood or years of friendship, Grace replied quietly, but he gave it freely because he believed in something I'm still learning to believe, that people can choose to become family, that love doesn't require history, only hope. I'm sorry you can't see what your brother saw in Second Chances. Winter's first snow fell gently on Millbrook Valley as Grace stood on her porch, no longer borrowed space, but truly home watching. Hope built a snowman with the natural artistry of childhood. The farm stretched before them in pristine white, peaceful and productive, a testament to months of careful tending and stubborn hope. Inside, Christmas preparations were underway, their first Christmas as residents rather than refugees, their first celebration in a place that welcomed rather than merely tolerated them. The legal battles were over, the inheritance secure, but more importantly, they had built something Edward could never have simply left them in his will: belonging earned through perseverance, respect gained through character, and a community that had learned to see past its own prejudices. Jonathan Pierce arrived for Christmas dinner, his presence a reminder of how far they'd all traveled from that terrible morning when Edward collapsed at the altar. He would be so proud, Jonathan said, watching Hope demonstrate her reading progress with books from Edward's extensive library. Not just of what you've accomplished, but how you've accomplished it with grace under pressure. If you'll forgive the pun, Grace laughed, the sound coming easily now in this house filled with warmth and acceptance. Through the window, she could see neighbors arriving for the community Christmas Eve service, their lanterns creating pools of light in the snowy darkness, each one a welcome, each one an acceptance of her place among them. Spring returned to Millbrook Valley with the promise of new beginnings. Grace's garden, replanted after the vandalism that seemed so distant now, burst with vegetables and flowers that would grace both her table and those of neighbors who'd become genuine friends. Hope thrived in the local school, her quick mind and generous heart making her a favorite among classmates and teachers alike. The inheritance that had once felt like borrowed time now represented security earned through trial, not just Edward's money and land, but the community's respect and her own hard-won confidence. Standing in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home, Grace realized she'd achieved something she'd never dared dream of, not just survival, but a life of purpose and joy. On the first anniversary of Edward's death, Grace took Hope to visit his grave in the peaceful cemetery overlooking the valley he'd loved. They'd brought wildflowers, the kind Hope had been braiding on that long-ago morning when they'd arrived, as strangers seeking sanctuary. "Tell me again about Mr. Edward," Hope requested, settling beside the simple granite stone that bore his name and dates. Grace smiled, her hand resting on the cold stone, as she repeated the story that had become family legend, how a kind man had seen potential in a desperate woman's letter, how love could exist without meeting, how gifts given freely create bonds stronger than blood. "He gave us more than a home," Grace concluded. "He gave us the chance to become who we were meant to be." The town's attitude toward Grace had evolved beyond acceptance into genuine affection and respect. She served on the school board now, organized charity drives for struggling families, and hosted harvest dinners that brought the community together. Hope, at 7, moved through Millbrook Valley with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted her place in the world, the gift Edward had intended from the beginning. Their story had become part of local folklore, told with pride rather than suspicion. The mail-order bride who became a pillar of the community, the outsider who belonged more truly than some who'd been born there. Catherine had moved to Denver, the fight gone out of her along with her bitterness, occasionally sending awkward but genuine letters asking after Hope's well-being. As Grace tucked Hope into bed on a warm summer evening, her daughter asked the question that had become their ritual. "Mama, do you think Mr. Edward knows we kept our promise?" Grace smoothed the golden hair that caught moonlight from the window, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think he knows we took his gift and made it grow into something even bigger than he imagined," she replied. "We didn't just inherit his farm and money, sweetheart. We inherited his faith that people can choose to love each other, that families can be built on hope instead of just history." Outside, the valley slept in summer peace, their homes secure among neighbors who'd become chosen family, their future bright with possibilities Edward had made real through one extraordinary act of faith in a stranger's courage.